The throne hall smelled like burnt ozone and alien perfume, and I was standing in front of 7 princesses, with blood still under my fingernails, from a war that nearly killed me. My name is Daniel Hartley. 3 weeks ago, I was bleeding out on the floor of Orvon Station, with a fractured rifle in one hand, and a dead Dreth soldier under my boot. Now I was wearing borrowed ceremonial armor that did not fit right across the shoulders, and Emperor Vorath himself was staring down at me from a throne carved out of a single blue crystal, waiting for me to choose my prize. The right of choosing. That is what they called it. An ancient Valori custom, not invoked in over 400 years, reserved for individuals who performed acts of such extraordinary valor that the empire owed them a debt beyond money or medals. The emperor had declared it publicly, broadcasted across 9 star systems, and now he could not take it back. The right allowed me to claim anything from the imperial household, ships, territory, wealth measured in units I could not even pronounce, or a royal bride. The 7 princesses of the Valori Empire stood on a crystalline platform at the far end of the hall, arranged by birth order. Thousands of courtiers filled the galleries above, their pale violet skin catching the light, their enormous dark eyes fixed on me with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. I was human, the first human most of them had ever seen in person. To them, I was a novelty at best, a performing animal at worst. A creature from a backwater planet nobody important had visited, standing in their most sacred hall, being given a privilege that their own kind had not received in centuries. My diplomatic liaison, a Valori official named Counselor Draven, had spent the last 6 days coaching me. He stood behind me now, practically vibrating with anxiety. He had told me exactly what to do, repeated it every morning like a prayer. Choose Princess Kalith, the firstborn. She was a fleet commander, a war hero in her own right, nearly 7 feet tall with silver-white skin and eyes like polished obsidian. Choosing her would bind me to the most powerful political faction in the empire. It was the smart play, the obvious play. Every political analyst, every military strategist, every whispering courtier in the galleries expected it. I walked the line. Princess Kalith stood at the head of the platform, towering, magnificent, looking through me the way you look through a window. I was beneath her notice. I could feel it radiating off her like heat from an engine. She carried herself with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told no in her life, and her posture said everything her mouth did not. She expected to be chosen. She was simply waiting for the formality to conclude. Behind her, the second princess, Thaleen, a diplomat famous for brokering a trade alliance with the Korath Federation. She had a politician's smile, warm on the surface, calculating underneath. Then Miriath, the third, who was considered the most beautiful woman in 12 star systems. She glanced at me with something like amusement, the way you might watch a dog trying to open a door. Isara, the fourth, was a scientist, her expression clinical and detached. Velith the fifth, a cultural minister who looked bored. Corinne, the sixth, a military logistics commander who studied me with professional appraisal, sizing me up the way a quartermaster evaluates equipment. And at the end of the line, standing slightly apart as though she had been added as an afterthought, was the seventh. Isirith. She was shorter than her sisters by at least a foot, thin, fragile-looking in a way that seemed wrong for the Valori, who prided themselves on physical perfection as evidence of divine favor. Deep scars ran from her left temple down across her cheek and neck, disappearing beneath the collar of a plain gray gown. No jewels, no ornamental armor, no rank insignia. Her hair was cut short where her sisters wore theirs, long and braided with metallic thread. She stood with her shoulders drawn in, her eyes fixed on the floor, as though she were trying to become invisible, as though she had spent her whole life practicing exactly that. I stopped in front of her. The silence that fell over the throne hall was unlike anything I had ever heard. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of 1,000 people holding their breath at the same time. I could feel it pressing against my eardrums, a physical weight. I turned to face the Emperor. "I choose the 7th princess," I said. "I choose Cirith." For exactly 2 seconds, nothing happened. The words hung in the air like smoke. Then the hall erupted. Not in cheers, in shock. Gasps rippled through the galleries like a physical wave. I heard whispered conversations ignite in every direction, sharp and scandalized, voices cutting through the ceremonial silence like knives. Counselor Draven made a strangled sound behind me that sounded like someone had stepped on his throat. On the platform, the princesses reacted in different ways. Maraeth raised one perfect eyebrow. Corin looked confused, her tactical mind trying to calculate what strategic advantage could possibly justify this choice. Thaleen tilted her head, as though trying to solve a mathematics problem she had never encountered before. Veleth and Isara exchanged glances that said the same thing. The human has lost his mind. Kalith did not move. Her expression did not change. But her eyes found mine, and what I saw in them was not surprise. It was something colder, something careful, something that looked almost like suspicion, as though a variable she had not accounted for had suddenly appeared in an equation she thought she controlled. And Cirith. Cirith looked up at me for the first time, and her expression nearly broke something in my chest. She was terrified, not the terror of someone facing danger, but the terror of someone who had learned long ago that attention meant pain, and now the most powerful room in the Empire was looking directly at her. Emperor Vorath leaned forward on his throne. He was old, ancient by Valori standards. His once violet skin faded to a pale lilac, his movements slow and deliberate. But his eyes were sharp, sharp enough to cut through ceremony and pretense alike. "Human," he said, and his voice carried through the hall like a bell. "You understand what you have spoken? The choosing cannot be repeated. It cannot be revised. What is declared in this hall is sealed by the blood of this dynasty." "I understand. You are aware of Princess Cirith's condition?" I felt a flash of anger at that word. Condition. As though she were a defective product on a clearance shelf. "I am aware of who she is," I said carefully, "and I have made my choice." The Emperor studied me for a long time. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the political machinery grinding through the implications. He was weighing the optics, the insult to his other daughters, the message this sent to every noble house watching the broadcast. He was considering whether to override the right, whether anyone would blame him if he simply declared my choice invalid and forced me to pick again. Precedent was thin. No one had tested the right in 400 years. The legal scholars would argue about it for decades. But the right was the right, sacred law, an unbroken chain of tradition stretching back to the founding of the empire. If he broke it now, in front of every major house and every broadcast feed in the empire, the political damage would be catastrophic. Every promise the imperial throne had ever made would become negotiable. Every treaty, every alliance, every oath would carry an invisible footnote, unless the emperor decides otherwise. His jaw tightened. I watched him swallow his objections one by one. "The choosing is honored," he said. "The human Daniel Hartley is bonded to Princess Cirith of House Vorath, 7th daughter of the imperial line." No one cheered. No one applauded. The court processed the announcement in stunned, offended silence, as though I had done something obscene in their most sacred space. Counselor Draven caught my arm as I stepped back from the platform, his grip tight enough to bruise. "What have you done?" he whispered. His voice was shaking with something between fury and despair. "Do you have any idea what you have thrown away? Kalith would have given you a fleet. Miraeth would have given you social standing across 12 systems. Political alliances that would have protected you for the rest of your life. And you chose the mute, the broken one, the princess who cannot even speak?" I pulled my arm free. "I chose the one I wanted," I said. "Now let go of me before I forget that you are a diplomat and not a target." He let go, but his face told me everything I needed to know. In his eyes, I had just committed the most spectacular act of self-destruction in galactic diplomatic history, and he was not wrong, not from his perspective. The bonding ceremony happened that same evening, in a small chamber off the main hall. It was supposed to be grand. It was supposed to be a celebration worthy of the rite. Instead, it felt like a burial. A Valori priest rushed through the ritual words with the enthusiasm of someone reading a parking citation, while a handful of obligatory witnesses stood in the back, refusing to make eye contact with either me or Sirith. She stood beside me through the entire ceremony, with her hands clasped in front of her, and her scars turned toward the wall. She did not look at me once. When the priest declared the bond sealed, she flinched, as though the words were a door slamming shut on whatever small freedom she had managed to carve out for herself. Afterward, we were escorted to our new quarters, not the grand suite that a choosing recipient would normally receive, not the chambers with the vaulted ceilings and the panoramic windows overlooking the imperial gardens. Instead, we were led through a series of increasingly narrow corridors to a far wing of the palace that I had not known existed. Sirith's wing. The walls here were bare. The lighting was dim, several fixtures flickering from poor maintenance. The staff was minimal, 2 elderly servants who regarded me with open hostility and moved through their duties with the silent resentment of people who had been assigned to a post that everyone considered a punishment. They left us in a sitting room that smelled like dust and closed windows. The door shut, the locks clicked, the silence pressed down like a hand on my chest. Sirith stood on the far side of the room, as far from me as the walls would allow. She held a small writing tablet in both hands, gripping it like a shield. Her eyes were on the floor again, and I could see a faint tremor running through her hands. She was waiting for whatever I was going to do, because in her experience, people in power did things, and she was expected to endure them. I pulled a chair away from a table, sat down heavily, and let out a long breath. The ceremonial armor creaked against the chair's frame. My shoulders ached. "I know you are scared," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, the same tone I used to talk to wounded soldiers in the field. "I know this is not what you expected. It is not what anyone expected. But I need you to hear me when I say this. I am not going to hurt you. I am not going to ignore you, and I did not choose you by accident or out of pity." She did not move, but she was listening. I could see it in the tension of her shoulders, the slight tilt of her head toward my voice. "I chose you because I had a reason," I said. "A real one. And when the time is right, I will explain it. But tonight, you are safe. That is all I need you to know." For a long moment, nothing happened. The room hummed with silence. Then, slowly, she raised the tablet and wrote something with careful, deliberate strokes. She turned it toward me, holding it at arm's length, as though ready to pull it back at any moment. It said, "No one has ever chosen me for anything." I looked at those words, and something in my chest tightened so hard it hurt. 7 words, 23 years of being invisible, compressed into 7 words. "Then everyone else was wrong," I said. She stared at me for another long moment, searching my face for the lie, for the angle, for the hidden cruelty she was certain was coming. When she did not find it, something shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest, most fragile possibility of trust, like a crack in a wall that might someday become a door. She turned and walked to her room, and closed the door softly behind her. I sat in the dim sitting room of a forgotten palace wing, surrounded by silence and dust, and I thought about what I had found in the wreckage of Orvon Station, about coded transmissions and imperial betrayal, and a conspiracy that went all the way to the top of the Valori power structure. And I knew I had made the right choice. The days that followed were quiet and careful, like walking through a room full of glass and trying not to break anything. Sirith and I settled into a cautious routine. She kept her distance at first, watching me from doorways and corridor corners, studying me the way a field researcher might observe an unfamiliar species that could be either harmless or deadly. She communicated entirely through her writing tablet, short, precise sentences, delivered with the economy of someone who had learned that words, even written ones, were a limited resource not to be wasted on people who did not deserve them. I gave her space. I made no demands. I showed up for meals in the small dining room attached to our quarters, and I talked, mostly to fill the silence and to show her that my voice was not a weapon. I told her about Earth, about the oceans, which fascinated her. She had seen images, but never understood the scale, and her eyes widened when I described standing on a beach and watching the water stretch to the horizon in every direction. I told her about human cities and the chaos of human traffic, and the way rain smelled on hot pavement in the summertime. I told her about forests so dense you could not see the sky, and mountains so tall they collected snow even in the warm months, and rivers that carved canyons through solid rock over millions of years. She listened, and sometimes she wrote a question on her tablet and slid it across the table with the tentative precision of someone offering a gift they were not sure would be accepted. How do humans survive without environmental shielding? Your planet seems hostile to your own species. It is hostile, I told her. Everything on our planet is trying to eat us, poison us, or crush us. We just got used to it. We figured out how to fight back, and we never stopped. She looked at me with something that might have been respect, or might have been the way you look at someone who has just admitted to something both admirable and clinically insane. Counselor Draven visited me on the third day, and he was not happy. He stood in our sitting room with his arms folded, and his face set in the rigid disapproval of someone who had staked his professional reputation on advising me, and now considered that reputation destroyed. He told me that the court was treating my choice as either a deliberate insult to the imperial family, or evidence that humans were mentally deficient, possibly both. My political standing had collapsed entirely. No one wanted to be associated with me. Invitations to diplomatic events had been withdrawn. My access to the Military Command Council, which I had earned through the war, was being quietly revoked. "You had the galaxy in your hands," Draven said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "You had an opportunity that no outsider has received in the recorded history of this empire, and you traded it for a princess who cannot speak, and whom the court considers a source of embarrassment. Thank you for the update, Counselor. You can leave now. I am trying to help you, Daniel. I am the only person in this palace still willing to be seen in the same room as you. Do you understand what that costs me? I understand that you are angry, because I did not follow your script. I appreciate your concern. The door is behind you." He left, slamming the door harder than necessary, and I stood at the window looking out at the palace gardens, which stretched across rolling violet hills beneath a sky the color of aged copper. Beautiful, alien, and I was isolated inside it, cut off from the power structures I needed, marginalized by a court that had decided I was either foolish or dangerous. Exactly where Draven said I was, but also exactly where I needed to be. On the fifth day, Cirith began to change, or rather, she began to let me see who she actually was, peeling back the layers of silence and withdrawal that she had built around herself like armor over 23 years. It started small. She left a tablet on the dining table one morning with a note that read, "The trade delegation from the Korath Federation arrived this morning. Thaleen is hosting them in the East Atrium. The lead delegate's name is Vor Hassin. He was sanctioned 2 years ago for illegal mineral trafficking in the Outer Reach, but the sanctions were quietly lifted after he made substantial donations to Thaleen's cultural foundation. The donations are not public knowledge. His daughter is enrolled in a Valori Academy under a false name. You should be aware of this." I read the note 3 times. Then I looked up at Cirith, who was standing in the doorway with her hands behind her back, watching me with an expression that was halfway between nervousness and challenge. "How do you know all of this?" I asked. She took the tablet back and wrote, "Nobody watches the person they have decided does not exist. I have had 23 years of watching. 23 years of sitting in corners during state functions. 23 years of walking through corridors where people speak freely because they have forgotten I am there. You learn things. You learn everything." Over the next several days, she opened up in ways I had not anticipated, and each revelation hit me like a series of escalating shocks. Her tablet notes grew longer, more detailed, more analytically devastating. She knew the political landscape of the Valori court the way a navigator knows a star chart, every route, every hazard, every hidden current. She knew which noble houses owed debts to which princesses. She knew about secret alliances and backdoor trade agreements that had shaped imperial policy for decades. She knew about personal feuds between military commanders that had influenced fleet deployments, about romantic entanglements between diplomats that had compromised negotiations, about financial arrangements that would constitute criminal fraud if they ever came to light. She knew things that intelligence agencies across 12 star systems would pay fortunes to acquire, and she knew them because she had spent her entire adult life invisible, in a palace full of powerful people who forgot she was in the room. She was a ghost with perfect recall, and an analytical mind sharper than any intelligence analyst I had ever worked with in my military career. She was brilliant, not in the dramatic, flashy way that Caliph was brilliant, commanding fleets and delivering speeches that made senates stand and applaud. Sirith's intelligence was quiet and precise, like a blade so sharp you did not feel the cut until you looked down and saw the wound. She saw patterns that others missed because others were too busy performing to observe. She saw the machinery behind the curtain, the levers and gears that made the empire run, and she understood how each piece connected to every other piece. One evening, I found her writing something that was not a note to me. She was working at a desk in the corner of the sitting room, and the tablet in front of her was connected to a larger display screen that she had apparently been using for years. She tried to close it when she heard me approaching, her hand darting to the controls with the reflexive speed of someone who had learned to hide her work. But I had already caught a glimpse of the text on the screen. "What was that?" I asked. She hesitated. Her fingers hovered over the controls. I could see the debate happening behind her eyes, the decades-old instinct to conceal fighting against something newer and more fragile. Then she turned the screen back on. It was a treatise, a detailed, meticulously researched analysis of Valori economic policy, specifically, the empire's dangerous dependency on Dreth mineral imports, and how that dependency could be systematically reduced through a phased investment program in asteroid mining operations across the Outer Reach territories. It included projected costs, timeline estimates, risk assessments, and a comparison with similar programs undertaken by other galactic civilizations. It was thorough, it was well-sourced, and it was clearly the product of years of careful, solitary research, conducted by someone with no resources except time, intelligence, and access to the palace's neglected academic databases. "You wrote this?" I asked. She nodded. "Is there more?" She hesitated again, longer this time. Then she opened a directory on the tablet. There were dozens of files: economic analyses, military strategy assessments, diplomatic frameworks for improving relations with civilizations the Valori had historically neglected, cultural reform proposals designed to make the empire more resilient against internal division, a comprehensive restructuring plan for the imperial intelligence apparatus, a detailed critique of current fleet deployment doctrine with suggested improvements. She had been writing them for years, document after document after document, a comprehensive, sophisticated vision for how the Valori Empire could be made stronger, fairer, more adaptable, and more resilient against both external threats and internal decay. Nobody had ever asked to see them. Nobody had ever known they existed. She had written an entire library's worth of policy analysis in a forgotten wing of the palace, preparing for a future that no one had ever intended to give her. "Sirith," I said, and the weight of what I was looking at settled on me like gravity. "You have been preparing to lead this empire your entire life." She wrote, "I have been preparing for something. I did not know what. Nobody was ever going to let me lead anything. But I could not stop. The problems were there, and I could see the solutions, and not writing them down would have been like watching a fire and choosing not to put it out." I sat down across from her, and for the first time since the choosing, I felt something beyond strategy or survival instinct guiding me. I felt admiration. Real, unguarded admiration for a person who had been discarded by everyone she had ever known, and had spent her years in exile building herself into the most qualified leader in the room, without an audience, without encouragement, without a single word of recognition. "Things are going to change," I told her. "I need you to trust me. There is something I found during the war, something that affects your entire family, your entire empire, and I need your help to act on it, because I cannot do it alone." She studied me for a long time, reading my face the way she read everything else, with patience and precision, and a refusal to accept surfaces at face value. Then she wrote, "I have been waiting for someone to say that for a very long time." That was the night everything shifted between us. Not into something romantic, something strategic, something more useful than romance. Two people with different skills and the same urgent problem. She had knowledge. I had the combat training and the nerve. Together, we might be able to do something that neither of us could accomplish alone. But before we could act, something happened that accelerated everything. A Dreth diplomatic envoy arrived at the palace. This was expected. The war was over. The hegemony had been pushed back from Valori territory, and now the diplomats were descending like carrion birds to pick at the remains. They came to negotiate a formal peace treaty, and Princess Calith was leading the negotiations on the Valori side. This made sense on the surface. She was the firstborn, a military commander, the heir apparent. She had the authority and the political stature to negotiate on behalf of the empire. What did not make sense was the treaty itself. I managed to get a copy through one of the few military contacts who still spoke to me, a fleet captain named Gideon Marsh, who had fought alongside my unit at 3 engagements before Orvan, and who did not care what the court thought of my choices. He slipped me a data chip during a brief meeting in a supply corridor, and I read the treaty provisions that night. The terms were wrong. The Valori had won the war, had repelled the Dreth invasion, had held their territory at enormous cost in lives and resources. But the treaty read like they had lost. Territorial concessions along the eastern frontier, trade agreements so heavily skewed toward Dreth interests that they amounted to economic tribute, a joint military command structure that would give the hegemony direct access to Valori fleet deployments and defensive positions, an intelligence sharing provision that would essentially allow the Dreth to see inside the Valori military apparatus. It was not a peace treaty. It was a surrender document dressed in diplomatic language, designed so that anyone who read only the summary would think it was a reasonable compromise, while the details quietly dismantled Valori sovereignty. I showed it to Cirith. She read it once, quickly. Then she read it again, slowly, her eyes moving across every line with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. Her expression did not change, but her hands tightened on the tablet until her knuckles went pale. I watched the color drain from her face as she reached the intelligence-sharing provisions, and I saw the moment when the full picture crystallized in her mind. She looked up at me, then she wrote 3 words, and turned the tablet toward me with a hand that was perfectly steady, despite the fury I could see burning behind her eyes. Calith is compromised. I stared at the note. Then I looked at Cirith, and she held my gaze without flinching. There was no fear in her eyes now, no hesitation. No trace of the trembling, withdrawn woman who had stood at the end of a line of princesses and tried to make herself invisible. What I saw was cold, certain knowledge, the kind that comes from watching the same person for decades and seeing every mask they have ever worn slip by fractions that no one else was close enough to notice. "Tell me everything," I said. And she did. "I need to tell you what I found at Orvan Station, because without that context, none of what happened next makes any sense. 3 months before the choosing, before the ceremony and the princesses and the politics, I was a mercenary, fighting in a war that was not mine. My company, the Ninth Light, had been contracted by the Valori Empire to supplement their ground forces against the Dreth hegemony. We were one of several human mercenary units operating in the sector, cheap labor by Galactic standards. Humans were small, soft-skinned, short-lived, and we came from a backwater planet in an unremarkable solar system that most species could not find on a star chart without assistance. But we were also stubborn in ways that genuinely confused other species, adaptable under conditions that would break creatures twice our size, and extremely difficult to kill in any permanent and reliable fashion. Those 3 qualities made us useful in the kind of grinding attrition warfare that the Valori were losing. The Ninth Light was a good unit. 26 soldiers, experienced, professional, the kind of people who understood that survival in alien wars required discipline, adaptability, and a willingness to do things that bigger and stronger species considered beneath them. Our commander was a woman named Catherine Lang, who had been fighting in off-world contracts since before I joined the company. She was smart, she was tough, and she cared about keeping her people alive. She died on the 3rd day of the Orvan siege, hit by a Dreth plasma round, while directing fire from an exposed position. She died because she was trying to save 3 of our soldiers who were pinned down in a maintenance bay. She saved 2 of them. The 3rd died an hour later. Orvan Station was a refueling depot on the edge of contested space. Not a fortress, not a strategic command center, just a waypoint, a place where ships stopped to refuel and crews rotated out. It should not have mattered in the larger scope of the war, but the Dreth wanted it because it sat at the intersection of three hyperspace corridors, and whoever controlled Orvon controlled the flow of supplies to the entire Valori Eastern Front. Take Orvon, and the Eastern Front would starve within 6 weeks. The Dreth hit us with a full assault force. 1,200 shock troops against a garrison of 90. Most of them support staff, mechanics, and communications technicians who had never fired a weapon in a combat situation. My unit was there for routine guard duty, filling time between deployments. 26 soldiers, plus 64 station personnel, against 1,200 Dreth shock troops in powered exoskeletal armor. The math was simple. We were going to die. But dying takes time when you are human, and we used every second of it. Catherine went down in the 3rd hour. By the 6th hour, 12 of our 26 were dead. By the 10th hour, I was the only one left from the 9th light. The surviving station personnel had retreated to the command level and sealed the blast doors. I was on the lower level, alone, holding a corridor junction that connected 3 critical passageways. If the Dreth got through me, they would have access to the station's reactor control systems, and they could shut down power to the entire facility, including the blast doors protecting the civilians above. So I held the corridor. For 19 hours. I am not going to tell you it was heroic. It was desperate and ugly and primal, and I spent most of it covered in fluids that were not mine. I barricaded the corridor with furniture, hull plating, and the bodies of Dreth soldiers who had already tried to come through. I used every weapon I could find, and when I ran out of ammunition, I used my hands, my teeth, and a length of metal conduit I had ripped out of the wall. The Dreth are bigger than humans, stronger, with natural armored exoskeletons that can turn a knife blade. But they do not expect a creature half their size to keep coming after it has been shot, stabbed, burned, and thrown through a structural wall. That was my advantage. I did not know how to stop. It is a human trait that other species find disturbing, and I used it without shame. But during the 14th hour, when there was a brief lull in the assault while the Dreth regrouped and brought up fresh troops, I did something that changed everything. The station's communication systems were damaged but not entirely destroyed. I crawled to an intelligence terminal in a side room, leaving a trail of blood that was mostly mine, trying to send a distress signal to Valori Fleet Command. The terminal was cracked and glitching, sparking intermittently, but it still had access to encrypted communication archives. While I was cycling through channels looking for a working frequency that could punch through the Dreth jamming, I stumbled into something I was never supposed to see. Coded transmissions, months of them, encrypted communications between a source inside the Valori Imperial family and the Dreth military command. The encryption was sophisticated, layers within layers, well beyond standard military grade, but the terminal's physical damage had corrupted the security protocols enough that fragments of the messages were visible in plain text. Like reading a shredded letter, pieces missing, but enough intact to understand the shape of the whole. I read what I could, while my hands shook from blood loss and exhaustion. Troop movements, fleet deployments, supply line schedules, defense grid activation codes, shield frequency rotations. Somebody inside the Valori royal family had been feeding the Dreth hegemony a comprehensive, ongoing stream of military intelligence for at least 8 months. That was why the Valori were losing. Not because the Dreth were inherently stronger, not because Valori's strategy was fundamentally flawed, but because the enemy knew every move before it happened. Every fleet redeployment, every supply convoy route, every defensive position change. The Valori had been fighting a war with their playbook open on the enemy's desk, and they had not known it. I could not identify the source from the fragments I recovered. The sender used a code designation rather than a name, and the metadata that might have revealed their identity was in the corrupted sections of the encryption. But the level of access was unmistakable. This was not a low-ranking officer selling information for money, and it was not a palace servant with a grudge. This was someone at the highest levels of the imperial household. Someone with direct, routine access to classified military briefings, strategic planning sessions, and operational deployment orders. Someone who attended war councils and sat in rooms where the Empire's most sensitive military decisions were made. I memorized what I could: patterns, code structures, dates, fragment phrases that might be useful later. Then the Dreth assault resumed, and I crawled back to my corridor and went back to fighting. When reinforcements finally broke through the Dreth perimeter 19 hours after the siege began, they found me sitting against the barricade with 7 broken bones, a punctured lung, second-degree burns across my left arm, and enough Dreth blood on my armor to fill a bathtub. They told me later that the relief commander, a Valori colonel, took one look at the corridor and the dead Dreth stacked in it, and asked how many humans had been defending this position. When they told him 1, he did not believe them until they showed him the security footage. They treated me, they promoted me, they called me a hero. Emperor Vorath himself invoked the right of choosing in my honor, broadcast it to 9-star systems as proof that the Empire honored valor, regardless of species. And the entire time, through every ceremony and speech and diplomatic reception, I stood in rooms full of Valori royals and military commanders, and I thought the same thing over and over again. One of you is a traitor, and I do not know which one. That was why I chose Cirith. Not because she was beautiful, not because I pitied her, not because I wanted to make a political statement, or embarrass the Emperor, or satisfy some bizarre human preference that the court whispered about. I chose her because she was the only member of the imperial family who could not possibly be the traitor. She had no access to military briefings, no political power, no connections to fleet command or intelligence services. She had been locked in a forgotten wing of the palace for 23 years, invisible to everyone, including whoever was feeding classified military intelligence to the Dreth. And I chose her because I needed an ally inside the palace who understood its politics, its secrets, and its hidden machinery. Someone who had been watching from the shadows for over 2 decades. Someone who had nothing to lose and nothing to hide. Someone the traitor would never see coming, because the traitor, like everyone else, had forgotten she existed. When I finally told Cirith all of this, sitting across from her in our quarters, on the 7th night after the choosing, she did not react the way I expected. There was no shock, no disbelief, no dramatic revelation. She read the fragments of coded transmissions I had transcribed from memory, studied them in silence for nearly 10 minutes, cross-referencing them against something on her own tablet, and then she looked up at me and wrote a single word. Finally. Finally, I said. She wrote, I have suspected something like this for 3 years. The war never made sense to me. The Dreth are strong, but they are not strategically brilliant. They are aggressive and direct, and they rely on overwhelming force. But in this war, they were always in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. Their ambushes were too precise, their counterattacks too well-timed. Someone was guiding them. I did not have proof. I had patterns and suspicions and a feeling in my gut that something was fundamentally wrong. Now you have given me the proof I was missing. You knew, I said. You already knew something was wrong. She wrote, I knew, and I know who it is. I have known for 18 months, but knowing and proving are different things, and nobody listens to the mute princess who sits in corners. She pulled up the timeline she had been constructing, a document stored deep in her personal files, encrypted with a code of her own design. She had been correlating Calith's movements, meetings, communications, and travel schedules with major Dreth military operations for the past 18 months. The pattern was devastating. Every time Calith attended a classified strategic briefing, the Dreth adjusted their operations within 72 hours. Every time Calith made one of her private trips to the outer territories, on what she called diplomatic goodwill tours, a Dreth offensive followed within a week. Every time the Valori High Command changed their fleet positioning, the Dreth countered the new positioning before it was fully implemented. The correlation was too consistent to be coincidence. It was too systematic to be a leak from a lower-level source, and it aligned perfectly with Calith's unique access to the War Council's most classified deliberations. I sat back and stared at the data. Cirith had done the groundwork without even knowing about the intercepted transmissions from Orvan. She had been building a case on observation alone, without evidence, without resources, without support, because that was what she did. She watched, and she remembered, and she put the pieces together, and she never stopped. Why did you not tell anyone? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. She wrote, Tell who? My father thinks I am defective. My sisters think I am furniture. The court staff pretend I do not exist. The military commanders would not grant me an audience if I begged for one. Who would have listened to the broken princess pointing a finger at the golden firstborn? I would have been dismissed as jealous, delusional, or confused. And if Caliph learned that I was watching her, I would have had another accident. The kind I would not survive. She was right. The tragedy of it was crushing. The most observant person in the empire, the person who had done the work and seen the truth, had the least credibility of anyone alive. The system had silenced her so completely that even if she screamed the truth from the top of the palace, no one would have heard. They will listen now, I said. You have me. I am a war hero, and the right makes me a legal member of the imperial household. That gives us standing. Together, we have enough to bring this to the emperor. She wrote, not yet. We have correlations and fragments. Caliph will deny everything, and she is the most persuasive person in the empire. We need hard evidence. Financial records, communication logs, something that connects her directly to the Dreth command in a way she cannot explain away. And we need to move fast, because the treaty she is negotiating is not just bad diplomacy, it is the endgame. Once it is ratified, the empire loses sovereignty legally, and there will be nothing anyone can do to reverse it. Over the following days, we launched a covert investigation that used both of our strengths like complementary weapons. I leveraged my status as a war hero to access military archives and operational records. Most of the senior officers still respected me for what I had done at Orvan, even if the court did not. Captain Marsh was particularly helpful, arranging access to classified databases and running interference when questions were asked. Sirith used her invisibility. She moved through the palace like a shadow, attending events she was technically invited to, but never expected to appear at. She sat in corners during diplomatic receptions, while powerful people spoke freely around her. She walked through corridors where confidential conversations happened behind doors that were not fully closed, because nobody remembered to check whether the scarred princess was nearby. She read documents left on desks by careless officials, who never imagined that the woman cleaning her tablet in the corner might be memorizing every word. The picture that emerged was worse than either of us had feared. The conspiracy was not just Caliph acting alone. She was the architect, the central node. But she had built an entire network. A faction of Valori nobles and military officers who believed the empire was in terminal decline and that the only path to survival was integration with the Dreth hegemony. They called themselves the Convergence. Their membership included 2 admirals, a dozen noble house leaders, the head of the Imperial Financial Authority, and at least 3 senior intelligence officials. Their plan was elegant in its treachery. They had used the war itself as a tool, deliberately prolonging the conflict and ensuring Valori defeats through Caliph's intelligence leaks, in order to weaken the empire's military capacity and erode public confidence in the emperor's leadership. Now, through the peace treaty, they would lock in a legal framework that would gradually transfer sovereignty to a joint Valori-Dreth governance structure, one that would be dominated by Dreth interests from the beginning. Caliph would be installed as figurehead empress, nominally ruling, but actually serving as a puppet for the hegemony, with the Convergence members rewarded with positions of power in the new order. The treaty was days from ratification. Once signed, it would be legally binding under Galactic law. The Valori Empire would effectively cease to exist as an independent civilization, and it would all look voluntary, clean, legal, irreversible. I found Sirith late one night in the archive vault, a sealed room deep beneath the palace where the oldest and most sensitive imperial records were stored. She had found the final piece, financial records showing large transfers from Dreth-controlled accounts to holding companies owned by members of the Convergence. Money that had been flowing for years, since before the war even started. It proved that this was not a response to crisis, but a premeditated conspiracy, planned and funded from the beginning. She was copying the files to a portable drive when the vault door opened behind us. Caliph's personal guards, 4 of them, tall and armored, moving with the precision of elite professionals. They fanned out to block the exits without a word, their movements rehearsed and exact. For a moment, I assessed the tactical situation the way I had been trained. 4 opponents, enclosed space, no weapons on my side, limited room to maneuver, no clear escape route. Then Caliph walked in. She was stunning, as always. silver-white skin catching the archive's dim emergency lighting, posture impeccable, expression as serene as a frozen lake. She looked at me, then at Sirith, then at the terminal screen still displaying the financial records. Her gaze lingered on the screen for 2 seconds, processing, calculating, adjusting. I wondered how long it would take, she said. Her voice was calm, almost conversational. The human soldier who chose the broken princess. I assumed at first it was sentiment, guilt perhaps, some misplaced notion of human compassion, or some bizarre mating preference your species is known for. But this is much more interesting. Caliph, I said. You found the transmissions at Orvan. I thought that terminal was destroyed in the bombardment. Clearly, I need to be more thorough with loose ends. She turned to look at Sirith with an expression of practiced contempt. And you brought your little project along. Tell me, Sirith, can you even understand what you are looking at, or did the human have to explain the complicated parts? Sirith did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. She held her sister's gaze with the same cold, absolute steadiness I had seen the night she wrote those 3 words about Caliph being compromised. It does not matter what you have found, Caliph continued, her tone shifting from amusement to something harder. Consider the practical reality of your situation. I am the firstborn princess of the Valori Empire and the commander of the Imperial fleet. I have the loyalty of a significant portion of the military and the noble houses. You are a foreign mercenary from a primitive species and a mute who the court considers a charitable embarrassment. Who do you imagine will be believed? She was right, and she knew it. That was the cruelest part. She was stating facts. You should have taken the political marriage and lived comfortably, Caliph told me. You could have had everything, Daniel. Ships, status, power, a life of luxury that your species can barely imagine. Instead, you chose this. She gestured at Sirith the way you might gesture at a broken piece of furniture someone had inexplicably decided to keep. And now you have nothing. No evidence, no allies, no way out of this room that does not go through me. Her guards took the portable drive from the terminal. They escorted us back to our quarters at Weapon Point, through corridors that had been emptied of staff and witnesses. They stationed additional guards at every exit, every window, every service access point. We were not arrested, not formally. There were no charges, no official detention order, nothing that would appear in any record. We were simply contained. Caliph was too sophisticated to create a scene. 2 people disappearing into a detention cell would raise questions and require explanations. 2 people quietly confined to their own quarters by order of the firstborn princess was just palace security maintaining order during sensitive diplomatic negotiations. The door closed, the locks engaged. I could hear the guards settling into position outside, the soft clink of their armor as they took up stations that covered every possible exit. Sirith sat down on the edge of a chair and pressed her hands together in her lap. She was shaking, but when she looked at me, her eyes were not frightened. They were burning with a fury so intense it seemed to heat the air around her. I looked at the locked door, then at the windows, then at Sirith. The treaty signing is in 48 hours, I said. If Caliph gets that document ratified, the empire is gone. Everything your family built, everything your people have been for 1,000 years, it ends with a signature on a piece of paper. We need to get to your father. She grabbed her tablet and wrote with sharp, aggressive strokes. The Emperor's private chambers are in the central tower. There are 3 security checkpoints between here and there, 2 locked blast corridors, and a biometric seal on his personal wing that requires Imperial family genetic verification. I have been through worse, I said. I held Orvan Station for 19 hours, with broken bones and no ammunition. I can get through a palace. She wrote, You held a single corridor against soldiers. This is different. This is a fortress designed by Valori architects who have spent 1,000 years perfecting internal security. Every corridor is monitored. Every intersection is covered. Every door is reinforced. Then I will need a guide, I said. Someone who knows every passage, every blind spot, every forgotten corridor and neglected maintenance shaft in this palace. Someone who has spent 23 years walking these halls with nothing to do and nowhere to be. She looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she smiled. It was small, barely there, and it did not entirely reach her eyes. But it was real. She wrote, I know them all. We planned through the night, working by the dim light of her tablet screen to avoid alerting the guards outside. Sirith drew maps from memory, detailed layouts of the palace's internal architecture that included passages and service corridors that did not appear on any official blueprint. She had found them over 23 years of wandering the palace with nothing to do and nowhere to be, forgotten maintenance shafts built during the original construction and never sealed, old servant passages from a previous architectural era, walled off during renovations but still physically intact behind thin panels. Ventilation routes wide enough for a person to crawl through, connecting wings of the palace that the official corridor system kept separate. The palace was an ancient building, layer upon layer of construction spanning centuries, and it was riddled with gaps and forgotten spaces, the way an old tree is riddled with the tunnels of insects that have long since moved on. Sirith knew them all, because she had walked every one, alone, at night, because sometimes the hidden places were the only places where she could breathe without feeling watched. I studied guard rotation patterns. I had been observing them since the day I arrived, a habit from my military training that I never turned off, cataloging shift changes and coverage gaps the way other people notice the weather. Calith's loyalist guards operated on a predictable 4-hour rotation with a 2-minute gap during shift changes when positions were momentarily uncovered. That gap was our window. At the next rotation change, we moved. I went through the window, not the door. The door was guarded and reinforced, but our quarters were on the 3rd level of the palace, and below us was a narrow decorative ledge that connected to an exterior maintenance walkway used by the engineering staff, who maintained the palace's climate control systems. Sirith had told me about it. She had walked it herself, alone, at night, years ago, because sometimes it was the only way she could feel the wind on her face without anyone watching. The walkway was narrow, and the drop was significant, but I had trained in worse conditions, and Sirith, despite her thin frame, moved with a sure-footed confidence that told me she had done this many times before. We reached a service entrance that opened into a vertical maintenance shaft running through the palace walls. We climbed in darkness, hand over hand, ascending through the guts of the building, while the sounds of the palace filtered through the walls around us. Distant voices, the hum of power systems, the click of boots on polished floors. We emerged into a sealed corridor on the palace's upper levels, a passage that had been closed off during a renovation 2 centuries ago and never reopened. From there, Sirith led me through a series of hidden routes I would never have found on my own, rooms that did not appear on any current floor plan, a narrow passage behind the Great Library's eastern wall, a service tunnel that ran beneath the throne hall itself, originally used to transport supplies during state events. The first security checkpoint had 2 guards. I dealt with them quickly and quietly, using close-quarters techniques that leveraged speed and precision over strength. Valori anatomy was different from human, but the nervous system operated on similar principles, and pressure applied to the right clusters produced the same result. They went down without a sound, and I secured them with their own restraining equipment. The second checkpoint was harder. 4 guards, alert and suspicious, clearly warned by Calith that I might attempt something. I used the architecture against them, making noise in a side passage to draw 2 of them out of position and into a tight space where their height and reach were disadvantages. I neutralized them in the confined space, then doubled back and hit the remaining 2 from behind before they could activate their communication devices. We reached the Emperor's private wing, one final locked door with a biometric seal that required Valori royal genetic verification. Sirith pressed her hand to the panel. For one terrible second, nothing happened, and I thought Calith had revoked her access. Then the door opened. Emperor Vorath was alone in his study, seated at a massive crystalline desk, covered in holographic displays, showing treaty documents and diplomatic correspondence. He looked up when we entered, and his expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and cold imperial anger in rapid succession. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he demanded. "How did you bypass my security? Guards?" "Your guards are resting," I said, "and you need to listen to what we have to say before you call for more, because in 48 hours, you will no longer have an empire to guard. You dare invade my private chambers? I granted you the choosing, human. I honored your service. I gave you a place in my household, And this is how you repay the trust of the throne? Your empire is about to be stolen from underneath you, I said, and your firstborn daughter is the one stealing it. That stopped him. His mouth opened, then closed. His anger did not disappear, but something else appeared alongside it, something he had been carrying for a long time and had refused to look at directly. Caliph has been feeding classified military intelligence to the Dreth hegemony for at least 2 years, I said. That is why you were losing the war. That is why the Dreth always knew your fleet positions, your supply routes, your defense grid configurations. And the peace treaty she is negotiating right now is not a peace treaty. It is a legal transfer of sovereignty that will turn the Valori Empire into a Dreth client state within a generation. This is absurd, the Emperor said. But his voice had lost its commanding authority. There was something underneath it now. Doubt. The kind of doubt that comes when someone tells you the thing you have spent years being afraid to think about. I laid out the evidence, methodically, systematically, without emotion. The intercepted transmissions from Orvan Station. The correlation data between Caliph's movements and Dreth military operations. The treaty provisions that made no strategic sense for a victorious empire. I spoke clearly and let the facts carry their own weight. The Emperor listened. He challenged points. He demanded clarification. He pushed back hard, because this was not just a political accusation. This was his firstborn daughter, his chosen heir, the child he had raised and trained and trusted to carry his legacy forward. Accepting what I was telling him meant accepting that the person he loved and trusted most had been systematically destroying everything he had built. But the evidence was overwhelming, and he was not a fool. I could see the truth settling on him like weight on a structure that was already cracked. And then Sirith did something that none of us expected. She stepped forward. She set down her writing tablet on the edge of his desk, deliberately, as though putting down a tool she no longer needed. She straightened her spine. She pulled her shoulders back. She lifted her chin until the scars on her face caught the study's amber light, and she did not try to hide them. She did not turn the damaged side away. She let him see all of her. She opened her mouth, and she spoke. Father. The word came out broken, rough, a sound like stones grinding against each other, barely above a whisper. Damaged vocal cords struggling to produce sound after more than a decade of silence, muscles atrophied from disuse fighting to remember movements they had long forgotten. The Emperor's face went white, genuine shock, not political shock, not strategic surprise, but the raw, unfiltered shock of a father hearing his daughter's voice for the first time in 13 years. Sirith, he breathed. She spoke slowly, each word an act of physical effort and will, her voice cracking and catching on consonants that her scarred throat could barely form. But the words themselves were precise, surgical, and devastating. She had spent 23 years preparing for a moment she never believed would come, and now that it was here, she did not waste a single syllable. She told him everything, not just what I had found, but what she had observed over more than 2 decades of being invisible in his palace. She described Caliph's secret meetings, citing dates and locations. She named the members of the convergence. She recounted conversations she had overheard, through doors that people forgot to close, because they forgot she existed. She laid out the entire conspiracy in systematic, chronological order, connecting each piece of evidence to the next with a logical precision that left no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. She did not plead. She did not cry. She did not appeal to his emotions or beg him to believe her. She governed. She presented the case the way a prosecutor presents a case, with facts arranged in irrefutable sequence, and she let the weight of truth do what no amount of tears could accomplish. When she finished, the silence in the study was absolute. The Emperor stared at his 7th daughter, as though he were seeing her for the first time in his life. And maybe he was. Maybe for the first time, he was looking at Sirith without the filter of pity or dismissal, or the quiet shame of having a defective child. He was seeing the woman she had become, in spite of everything he and his court had done to her. "How long?" he whispered. "How long have you been watching?" "Always," she said. That single word cost her visible pain, but she said it clearly, and she did not look away. The Emperor closed his eyes. When he opened them, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. The doubt was gone. In its place was something I recognized from the battlefield. Resolve. The look of a person who has finally accepted an unbearable truth and decided to act on it. He activated his personal communication system and issued a summons to the full imperial court. Emergency session. Mandatory attendance. No exceptions. 2 hours later, I stood beside Cirith in the great throne hall, the same hall where I had chosen her, the same crystalline platform, the same galleries filled with courtiers. But everything was different now. The atmosphere had changed. The courtiers filed in with confusion and irritation, and more than a little fear, summoned from sleep in the middle of the night cycle, by an imperial command that offered no explanation. Caliph arrived last, flanked by 2 of her remaining personal guards. She was composed, immaculate, showing no sign that anything was wrong. She radiated the same effortless authority she always radiated, the golden firstborn, the natural leader, the woman everyone assumed would be empress. She took her position at the foot of the throne platform and looked up at her father with an expression of patient, filial concern. "Father, this is highly irregular. The treaty negotiations are at a critical juncture, and the Dreth delegation is expecting my return in the morning. Whatever this is about, I am sure it could wait until a more appropriate hour." "You will not be returning to the negotiations," the Emperor said. "You will not be returning to anything." The silence that followed was different from the silence at my choosing. That had been shock, surprise, theatrical disbelief. This was fear. The kind of fear that ripples through a crowd when they realize something is truly wrong, and they do not yet know how wrong. The Emperor presented the evidence. He called me forward first, and I described what I had found at Orvanan Station, the coded transmissions, the intelligence leak that had cost thousands of Valori lives over 2 years of war. I spoke as a soldier, direct, factual, without embellishment or emotion. The court listened because they had to. Whatever they thought of my choices, I was the man who had held a corridor for 19 hours with his bare hands, and that earned me the right to speak in this room. Then Cirith stepped forward, and the hall went perfectly still. The courtiers stared. Most of them had not seen Cirith in years. Some of the younger ones had never seen her at all. The scarred princess, the broken daughter, the one who could not speak, standing before the full imperial court in a plain gray gown with no jewels and no armor, and no reason to be there except that she had something to say. And she said it. Her voice filled the throne hall the way water fills a crack in stone, slowly, painfully, but with an unstoppable force that no amount of resistance could contain. She spoke about the convergence. She named its members, watching each one in the galleries flinch or pale as their name left her lips. She described their meetings, their financial arrangements, their communications with the Dreth command structure. She dismantled the conspiracy piece by piece with the precision of a surgeon cutting away diseased tissue, and the court watched in stunned, absolute silence as the daughter they had forgotten proved herself the most informed person in the empire. Caliph maintained her composure for the first several minutes. She listened with an expression of calm disbelief, occasionally shaking her head with practiced sorrow, occasionally letting out a small breath that suggested patient sympathy for a delusional sister. When Cirith paused to let her damaged voice rest for a moment, Caliph stepped forward and addressed the court. "I understand that this must be confusing," she said, her voice warm and reasonable and pitched perfectly to inspire confidence. "And I have genuine sympathy for my sister, who has clearly been manipulated by the human into believing a fantasy that serves his political interests. The truth is far simpler than this dramatic narrative would suggest. The treaty I have negotiated represents the best possible outcome for an empire that was on the verge of military and economic collapse. We won a single battle. One human held one corridor. That does not win a war. The Dreth hegemony remains powerful, and without pragmatic accommodation, they will return stronger and better prepared. What I have done is not treason. It is pragmatism. It is survival. It is leadership." She was good. She was magnificent. Her voice was strong and measured. Her arguments were logical and proportionate, and she delivered them with the confidence of someone who had been commanding attention and shaping opinions since before I was born. I could see the court wavering. Some of the nobles were nodding along. The idea that the strong, brilliant, proven firstborn princess was a pragmatic leader making difficult choices was much easier to accept than the idea that she was a traitor selling out her civilization. Sirith responded. She did not raise her voice, because she could not. She did not gesture dramatically, or appeal to emotion, or deliver a rousing speech. She simply pulled apart Calith's argument with facts, systematically, thoroughly, like someone dismantling a machine to show the broken parts inside. She addressed the treaty provisions one by one, showing how each individual concession was not pragmatic, but deliberately designed to erode a specific pillar of Valori sovereignty. She showed the financial trails that connected Convergence members to Dreth funding, money that had been flowing for years before the war even started, proving beyond question that this was not a response to a crisis, but a conspiracy, planned and funded from its inception. She described specific communications she had observed between Calith and the Dreth ambassador, conversations that took place in private rooms, where Calith believed absolutely no one was watching. You met with Ambassador Vorthelen in the South Gallery on the 14th day of the last moon cycle, Sirith said, her voice cracking but relentless, refusing to stop despite the pain. You discussed the timeline for treaty ratification. He told you the Hegemony Council was growing impatient with the pace of progress. You told him our father was old and malleable and would not obstruct the process. You laughed when you said it. The color drained from Calith's face. Not slowly. All at once, like someone had pulled a plug. That detail, the location, the date, the specific words, the laugh, was too precise, too specific, too intimate to fabricate. The court saw it. Every person in the galleries saw the moment when Calith's mask slipped, just for an instant, and behind it was not confidence or leadership, but cold calculation caught in the light. This is ridiculous, Calith said, but her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What remained was sharp and defensive, and slightly too fast. The voice of someone whose rehearsed narrative was collapsing, and who was improvising from a position she had never expected to occupy. You are listening to a woman who has not spoken in over a decade, a woman whom everyone in this room knows is mentally and physically compromised, and a human who understands nothing about our politics or our civilization. I am the firstborn of this house. I have given my entire life to this empire. You have given our empire to the Dreth, Sirith said quietly, and you spent 2 years making sure no one would ever know. The mask cracked fully. The composure, the diplomatic warmth, the reasonable tone, all of it fell away in an instant, and what came through was raw, unfiltered contempt that had been building for decades. You ungrateful, broken creature, Calith said, her voice rising in a way the court had never heard before. You have spent your entire pathetic life hiding in corners and scribbling on tablets like a child playing at governance, and now you stand in this hall and dare to judge me? You are nothing. You have always been nothing. You were an accident of birth that should have been corrected early, and the only reason you still exist is because our father was too weak and too sentimental to do what needed to be done, when it would have been easy. The court went rigid. Even Calith's supporters, even the courtiers who had been nodding along with her defense, recoiled. The venom in her voice was too raw, too genuine, too revealing of something ugly that had been hidden behind a lifetime of political polish. The shuttle, Sirith said quietly, and the hall went silent again. The accident when I was 7 years old, the shuttle malfunction, that scarred me and destroyed my voice. It was not an accident. Calith hesitated. 1 second, 2 seconds, and in that hesitation, the truth was written as clearly as if she had confessed aloud. You arranged it, Sirith continued, her rough voice steady and unbreakable. Or your people arranged it on your behalf. I was too young to be a real threat, but you saw potential even then, and you could not tolerate even the possibility of future competition. You had a child scarred and silenced, to protect your position as heir. I was 7 years old. That is a lie, Calith said, but the word came out hollow, and every single person in the hall heard it ring false. Then explain why Attendant Lysara, who was responsible for the shuttle's pre-flight maintenance, received a payment of 40,000 Imperial credits 2 days before the malfunction. Credits traced through 3 intermediary accounts to a holding fund controlled by Lord Desarin, your personal financial advisor for the past 26 years. Caliph stared at her sister across the hall. The silence was so complete I could hear the hum of the palace's power systems through the crystal walls. Then she broke. Not with dignity, not with the composed resignation of a leader accepting consequences. She broke the way a dam breaks when the pressure finally exceeds the structural limits, everything behind it pouring out in a torrent of venom and fury, and 20 years of concealed contempt for everything and everyone around her. She called Sirith every degrading name the Valori language contained. She called the Emperor weak, foolish, a relic clinging to a throne he no longer deserved. She called the court blind, complacent, a collection of perfumed cowards who had let their empire rot, while they attended banquets and admired their own reflections. She declared that the empire deserved to fall, that the Valori were a dying species, clinging to traditions that had outlived their purpose, that the Dreth at least had the vision and the will to build something new, something stronger, something that did not depend on the approval of an aging emperor and a court of fools. She confessed to everything, not because she wanted to, but because her rage had consumed her discipline, and the truth poured out of her like a river through a broken wall, unstoppable, and devastating, and impossible to take back. The court guards moved forward. Caliph's personal guards looked at each other, then at the assembled nobles, then at the expressions on the faces of the 1,000 courtiers who had just watched their golden princess destroy herself. The guards stepped aside. They were soldiers, not fanatics, and they could read the room. Princess Caliph, firstborn of House Vorath, commander of the Imperial Fleet, architect of the Convergence, was taken into custody in the same hall where she had once been celebrated as the inevitable future of the empire. In the days that followed, the Convergence was dismantled. 17 nobles, officials, and military officers were arrested across the empire. The Dreth ambassador was expelled from Valori space under escort. The treaty was voided in its entirety, every provision struck from the record. And across the empire, from core worlds to frontier stations, people began to learn the name Sirith for the first time. Emperor Vorath summoned me to his study, 3 days after Caliph's arrest. He looked older than he had before, physically diminished, as though the revelation had subtracted years from his remaining lifespan. He sat behind his crystalline desk and stared at his hands for a long time before he spoke. "I failed her," he said. He did not need to specify which daughter he meant. "I let them convince me that she was broken. I let them hide her from me. I let a child be scarred and silenced, and I accepted the lie that it was an accident, because accepting the truth would have required me to look at my eldest daughter and see a monster, and I was not strong enough for that. So I looked away. For 23 years, I looked away. I did not offer comfort. He did not deserve it yet. The comfort would come later, if he earned it." "She is not broken," I said. "She is the most capable leader in your family. She has been preparing to govern this empire her entire life, writing policy analyses and governance frameworks, and strategic assessments in a forgotten wing of your palace, while you pretended she did not exist." He flinched at that. "I know," he said quietly. "She sent them to me. All of them. 74 documents. I have been reading them for 3 days straight. Economic reform, military restructuring, diplomatic strategy, cultural revitalization. Every problem I have struggled with for the past decade, she has already solved. On paper, in silence, without a single resource or a single word of encouragement." He paused. "I am abdicating." I had not expected that, but I understood it immediately. "Not today," he continued. "The transition must be orderly, and the empire needs stability after what has happened. But I am naming my successor. And it will be Sirith." "The court will resist," I said. The court watched her dismantle a conspiracy that none of them even suspected existed. They watched her speak for the first time in 13 years and deliver the most devastating political testimony in the recorded history of this empire. They may grumble, they may whisper in their private rooms about tradition and precedent and the proper order of succession, but they cannot argue with what they saw. She proved herself in front of every noble house, every military commander, every diplomatic observer in the empire. She proved herself in the most public and undeniable way possible. He was right. The court might resist in private, but they had seen what I had seen. The overlooked princess was the only one who had been paying attention, the only one who had prepared, the only one who had the knowledge, the intelligence, and the moral authority to lead. And she had done it not because anyone had groomed her for the role, but because she had groomed herself, alone, in silence, because she could not stop herself from doing what she knew was right. That evening, I found Cirith in the palace gardens. The Valori sky was streaked with bands of copper and deep violet, the twin moons rising over distant hills that rolled like frozen waves of purple grass. She was sitting on a stone bench near a fountain that had been repaired recently, probably for the first time in years. She had her tablet in her lap, writing something, and when she saw me approaching, she closed it and made room for me to sit beside her. We sat in silence for a while, not the uncomfortable silence of our first days together, when every quiet moment was loaded with uncertainty and fear. This was the easy, companionable silence of two people who had been through something extraordinary together, and did not need words to acknowledge it. Eventually, she picked up the tablet and wrote something. Old habit, she could speak now, and she had been speaking more each day as her voice slowly strengthened, but speaking still hurt, and with me, she did not need to perform. With me, she could communicate however she was most comfortable. She turned the tablet toward me. You could have chosen anyone. You could have had power and wealth and political standing and a life of comfort. Why did you choose me? I thought about it. I thought about Orvan Station, about 19 hours alone, in a corridor, with nothing but stubbornness and fury keeping me upright. I thought about what it felt like to be underestimated, to be dismissed, to be treated as lesser by species who looked at my size and my lifespan and my fragile skin and assumed that meant I was weak. I thought about every moment in my life when someone had looked through me, the way those princesses had looked through me on the platform, as though I were not worth the effort of seeing. Because I recognized you, I said. Not your face, not your name. I recognized what you are. On my planet, humans spent thousands of years being told we were nothing, too small, too fragile, too slow, too primitive. Every predator on our world was bigger, stronger and faster. Every environment was trying to destroy us. We should have gone extinct 100 times over, but we survived. Not because we were the most powerful thing in the room, but because we watched, we learned, we adapted, and we never, ever stopped getting back up. I looked at her scars, the ones that ran down her face and neck, the marks of a violence inflicted on her when she was too young to understand why, and I did not look away. You are the most human person I have ever met, I said, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. She studied me for a long time, her dark eyes searching my face with the same meticulous attention she brought to everything else. Whatever she was looking for, she found it. She wrote, "Stay," not as a prize, not as a bonded consort, not as a political arrangement. Stay as a partner, as an equal. I am going to need someone beside me who sees what others miss, and who is not afraid to tell me the truth. I am not going anywhere, I said. 2 weeks later, the coronation took place in the Great Throne Hall. Every seat in the galleries was filled. Every broadcast channel in the empire carried the ceremony live. Dignitaries from a dozen civilizations sat in the observers' gallery, watching with fascination as a species they barely knew performed the most important political transition in 4 centuries. Cirith wore white, the traditional color of Valori sovereignty, and she did not cover her scars. She walked the length of the throne hall, with her head high, and her back straight, and her gaze level and steady. And 1,000 courtiers, who had spent decades pretending she did not exist, rose to their feet as she passed. Some of them bowed from genuine respect, some from political calculation, some from shame. But they all bowed, because she had earned it in a way that no one could deny. The crown was a simple circlet of blue crystal, ancient, older than the palace itself, said to be carved from the same stone as the emperor's throne. Emperor Vorath placed it on her brow with trembling hands, and when he stepped back, he was no longer an emperor. He was a father seeing his daughter clearly for the first time in her life. And the weight of that recognition, the joy and the grief and the shame of all the wasted years, was written across his face for everyone to see. Cirith turned to face the court. She did not smile. She did not cry. She stood in silence for a long moment, letting them look at her, letting them see every scar, every mark of the violence that had been done to her, and the life they had forced her to live. She was not hiding anything. She was not performing. She was simply present, completely and unapologetically, for the first time in her existence. And then she spoke. Her voice was still rough, still damaged, still the voice of someone who had been broken, and who had rebuilt herself word by painful word, sound by painful sound. But it carried through the hall with an authority that no amount of vocal polish or oratorical training could have matched, because every person listening knew that this voice had been silent for 13 years, and the person speaking had chosen to break that silence, not for herself, but for an empire that had never done anything to deserve her loyalty. This empire was nearly lost, she said. Not to an enemy fleet, not to an invasion we could not repel. It was nearly lost to the assumption that power belongs only to those who look the part. I do not look the part. I never have. And I spent 23 years being punished for it. But in those 23 years, I watched this empire. I studied its strengths and its weaknesses. I learned its secrets and its blind spots. I prepared, not because anyone asked me to, not because anyone believed I would ever have the opportunity, but because the work needed to be done, and I was the only one willing to do it. She paused and looked across the hall, her gaze moving slowly from face to face, meeting the eyes of nobles and commanders and diplomats and servants alike. I do not ask for your sympathy, she continued. I do not ask you to feel guilty for what was done to me. I ask you to learn from it. This empire's greatest vulnerability is not military or economic. It is the habit of measuring worth by appearance, of deciding who matters and who does not, based on what is visible on the surface. That habit nearly destroyed us. It will not be allowed to continue. The court was silent. Then, starting in the back rows and spreading forward like a tide, they began to kneel. Not all of them. Not yet. Some held back, stubborn or resentful, or simply not ready to accept that the world had changed so fundamentally. But enough. More than enough to know that the tide had turned, and would not turn back. Across the galaxy, the Dreth hegemony received a formal diplomatic transmission from the new Valori Empress. Her voice was quiet and rough, and carried the audible marks of old damage, and it was absolutely unbreakable. She informed them that all previous treaty negotiations were void, that any future diplomatic engagement would be conducted on Valori terms, that the intelligence leak had been identified and sealed, and that the Empire was under new management. I stood behind her as she delivered the message, watching the holographic display that showed the Dreth Command Council receiving her words in real time. I could see their faces across the light years, confusion at first, then reassessment, and underneath it, settling into their expressions like cold water seeping into cracks, the beginning of something they were not accustomed to feeling. Fear. Not fear of fleets or weapons or the raw military power of the Valori Empire. Fear of the unknown. Fear of a leader they had not anticipated, had not planned for, had not believed possible. Fear of a variable they could not predict, because everything they thought they knew about the Valori imperial family had just been proven catastrophically wrong. Because the galaxy had made a mistake. The same mistake it always makes. The same mistake it has been making since the first civilizations looked up at the stars and decided that the biggest, brightest, loudest thing in the sky must be the most important. It looked at what was powerful and polished and prominent and assumed that was strength. And it overlooked what was small and quiet and scarred and assumed that was weakness. Humans learned a long time ago that the universe does not work that way. The things that survive are not the things that roar the loudest or shine the brightest. They are the things that endure when everything is trying to break them, the things that adapt when the rules change, the things that watch and learn and wait and prepare, the things that get knocked down and stand back up, over and over, until the universe runs out of ways to knock them down. Cirith understood that. She had lived it her entire life, longer and more painfully than I had, and she had never stopped preparing, never stopped working, never stopped believing that someday the world would need what she had built in silence. And now she sat on a throne, wearing a crown, with an empire at her feet, and a galaxy watching, and the scars on her face were not blemishes. They were credentials. I stood at the window of the throne hall and watched the twin moons rise over the Valori hills, and I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Not because everything was perfect, not because the challenges ahead were small or simple. The Dreth were still out there. The Convergence's damage would take years to repair. The court would need time to fully accept its new empress, and the galaxy would be watching every move she made, waiting for her to fail. She would not fail. I had seen what she was made of. I had watched her build an empire's worth of preparation in a forgotten room with no resources and no encouragement and no reason to believe it would ever matter. And I had watched her stand before 1,000 hostile courtiers and speak the truth in a voice that should not have been able to speak at all, and break a conspiracy that had nearly destroyed everything her people had built. She would not fail, because she was the one who had done the work. The real work. The unglamorous, invisible, thankless work of watching and learning and preparing, day after day, year after year, in silence. The galaxy has a habit of measuring worth by what shines brightest. Humans learned a long time ago to look harder than that. The overlooked, the scarred, the silent. They are the ones who survive. They are the ones who see everything. And when they finally speak, empires listen.